Now, to the topic at hand,
Yes.
for more literal changes. New World is less than 2 years old and has just gone back and revamped their new player experience.
Yeah, and that's
World of Warcraft just
wild.
released Dragonflight and went back to talent trees. A lot of my friends that have asked me, like, why are you going to play it? It just looks like a nostalgia trip. And I was like, that's all I've been asking for.
Yeah.
For 4 years, all of my complaints about WoW have been stop trying to make something new. There's other companies like Ashes making something new. Make World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft is a good game. Go make World of Warcraft. That's what you do best. Go back to the basics. And it can have some gimmicky stuff like dragon riding and all that. But ultimately, Dragonflight just feels like a World of Warcraft game. And I think that's a good thing. It doesn't so far feel like system on system on system. I'm only cleared of 2 of the zones, but I have dabbled in like crafting. I've dabbled in dailies. I've been dabbling around. So I've been jumping around. I'm not leveling very efficiently. So I can taste as much of it as possible as they go through those zones.
Yeah.
So they're doing that right? They're getting back to basics. And yet New World's changing the formula. One of the reasons you were frustrated with Final Fantasy 14 is that it's been stagnant. But one of the reasons I'm loving Final Fantasy 14 is that like I feel like I have control of this formula and I know what I'm aiming for.
It's safe. It's like, and it's that,
it feels good to know exactly what I want to do in 6.3, even if I don't know what's coming, and exactly what I want to do in 6.4, even though they haven't announced yet.
It's one of the things also from a content creator perspective that in its delivery, Ed, the fact is that you have a spreadsheet. Chances are if you're off maybe by a week, like in terms of prediction of when the content rolls out. And that's a real strength to be able to communicate that to players who dip in and dip out. Like that's one of the things that I've talked about where we're at with New World. We've just finished the first roadmap that was provided to the community. And I was like, well, now's a really good time because they've told us what's coming for the game, right? Like we know that they're going to work on the rest of the leveling experience. They refreshed the 1 to 25 experience, and I think they really did a good job. We got to play through that on the Fresh Start server, and I was like, oh wow, this definitely feels like it's easing you more into the game, but it doesn't like restrict you. You could still, if you want to run up to Shattered Mountain at level 1, go for it. Like the game's not going to sit here and restrict you, but like it does say, hey, let's go about this way. We're going to teach you these things. We're going to get you leveled up pretty quickly and get you into kind of more of the higher end content. And then they said they'll work on like the 26 through 50 or the 26 through 60 experience.
Sure, you got
based off of but based off of feedback that they get off of this. I was like, oh, that's interesting. It's interesting that they're taking the time to do that. But what we don't have, especially in this space, is when somebody says, hey, Brian, we know mounts are coming. We know loadouts are coming. We know like cross servers coming. We know all this stuff is coming, but I can't sit down and tell you when to expect it. And that makes it difficult because if let's say the big thing in your MMO experience is mount collection, right? Or something like that. Hey, Brian, when's that coming? Well, I don't know. I know that they're working on it, but if they had some kind of roadmap, at least some kind of idea, even if it was just slated for 2023, right? Like, I don't need it to be day and date. They don't need to lay it out like point by point, like where we've been covering 14 so long that like we have it point by point. But I would still like to be able to kind of like say, hey, this is when you could start to expect it. So the spectrum here is that content creation, like, it's coming. Well, I guess we'll keep you up to date when we find out, as opposed to like in the case of 14, it's like, we know how this is going to function. This is how it's always functioned, and this is how it's going to continue to function, unless Yoshi P decides to sit here and say, hey, now is a good time as any to revamp a certain experience. And they've somewhat done that, obviously, with the trusts, bringing those in to the core game experience, allowing more people to kind of ease their way into kind of the multiplayer aspect. But then the question is that when would be the right time for them to kind of revamp like an end game experience or like the mid game experience? Because as the level cap continues to shift forward, that mid game experience also kind of, becomes broader as well. So like in terms of it, like your experience with WoW and the changes that they've made with the fact that they've gone back to talent trees, did you see like one of the Ian and the Preach interview about,
I did watch that. Yeah.
So he was talking about how like they had such a good response to the Legion kind of system. And it wasn't till the end of Legion that all of a sudden people started being frustrated with how that system was working. And then that by that time they've already done a lot of the work. And so to kind of pivot
Right.
It took years to kind of get back to the talent
You're
trees.
making pot roast. Pot
Yeah.
roast sits in the oven for hours. People are starting to get sick from the first round of pot roast, but you already made the second roast after you came out and said, "How is it?" And everybody said, "It's amazing." And so you've been back in the kitchen slaving away, and now they're like, "Hey, you're not going to bring out more pot roast, are you?" And they're like, "Ugh." And so yes, that modular design, right, means that parts don't age on, but also the fact that they have to build these games so far in advance. That's why it's so surprising to see New World already putting new player experience in, because when you look at the bigger games that have been around, that decade plus line was the line that pre-choosed. So Guild Wars 2, Final Fantasy 14, and World of Warcraft are kind of the big three in my life that are over 10 years old. Once they're that big, to make sure you don't accidentally break anything, to continue supporting all the past and community, the existing community, and to plan for the future, a lot of times when you get something, be it Blue Mage, be it Island Sanctuary, be it all the features within, like reintroducing Living Season 1 and Guild Wars, those things don't happen overnight. They take years sometimes.
Oh yeah.
And so how do you know? I mean, it's like deciding to order an umbrella off the internet that's going to arrive in 5 days and it's never rained where you live. Like, how do you predict where the game's going to be years from now when you're operating on initial impressions of today's content and burned out impressions of old content? So like, you don't really have any true impressions of anything, because the veteran players are jaded about the old stuff, even though they liked it at the time. And the new stuff's like, this is amazing, I'm going to love it forever. And you're like, well, no, you're not. Right. And so like, how do you,
just wait a couple expansions and we'll see how, and you'll pick up on the pattern, you know?
And so
I think there's a lot of it doesn't get covered a lot, but within game development, there's a lot of research and R&D and development. And they have numbers and stats that we could only hope to have. And if we had that data and that information, like, it would be so interesting to see, because I think there's a lot of assumptions that everybody makes, every gamer makes, about how game development works. The thing is that when you're talking about, there's a couple of factors here, right? Because like Yoshi P talked about how they don't have any tech debt, which was like a complete lie, because everybody has tech debt. You have tech debt every sprint, you know? So it's like, depends on like how he's interpolating the answer.
He said it in October,
and then
in the Larry Zor Media Tour interview,
and then
in December came out after all the server things and said, so what it turns out is, like, in the game there's no technical debt, but in their server backend
there was.
But
there's tech debt on every sprint that you track. But it felt like when I was like 10 and my mom's like, did you clean your room? And you're like, yeah. And then she goes and she opens your closet and that's where you've shoved everything. You're like, you said my room, I didn't clean my closet. Like, like that's just shoved it all.
I didn't lie to you. I did clean my room. I put it all in the closet.
But when it comes down to that, when you start talking about like game development, even at like, because like within the world of it, it's like you're talking about 6 months, 12 months, like 18 months, 2 years, you know, and then all of a sudden you start thinking about like, okay, you're working on these features and this stuff for a long time. What Final Fantasy 14 does really well, especially narratively, is before they even like, they go and before they expand, like as the expansion of Endwalker's launched, they're already writing and completing the story for the next expansion. They're all getting together and they're doing that work so that there's never a moment where they're kind of writing themselves into a corner, because they've already sit here and plotted it out, because it takes so long to develop the cutscenes, the animations, especially the voices and things like that. So they do a lot of the work in the pre-planning and in the pre-phase, which basically allows them to continue to be flexible and track that stuff. So along those lines, they've been able to do all of this so well. But what you have to look at is like, what's the cost? What's the real risk, right? Like, that's really what you're getting at, is that all of a sudden you make a change. Like, I thought Eureka was really cool, but it invited me to go play Final Fantasy 11, because Final Fantasy 11 is more fully featured. And there was things in Eureka that I was like, oh man, it would be so cool if X. Oh, Final Fantasy does that. Final Fantasy 11 does that. I'm going to go back and do that. But then they took that, iterated on that, and made Boja, which I thought was a really great system. I loved that whole system within Boja. And that was the process of the iteration, but there's still people who didn't necessarily enjoy it. So when it comes down to that, their strength, which is a frustration point of mine, but their strength in terms of siloed content, it allows them to be experimental, to iterate without affecting the core gameplay. Imagine somebody stepping into the game today and all of a sudden the entire open world is like Boja. If it's been a while since you played, if you're coming back, maybe that's going to be something you like. But chances are, based off of how like the modern theme park MMO RPG is, you probably might be frustrated. And I think there's a greater risk. And so when it comes to the business side of things with what Yoshi P and the teams have planned, they look at what the core pillars of strength the game have is. Same thing kind of with World of Warcraft, same thing with New World, but New World's still like in this early phase of development. You look at what the core pillars of strength, what the community also values, and you start to think like, okay, story, they value the raids. You have these kind of aspects, and I think it's risky if they go and change those systems. Like the risk is really great, and so you have to have like probably either a ton of market research, or you have to experiment within your own internal silos, because there isn't a PTR in Final Fantasy XIV's case. You test within these silos. And then you find something that like maybe the vast majority of people want, because Yoshi P's always said he wants to make the game that the players want to play. And I think when you look at the numbers, just what we look at with the pre-patch, expansion hype, with the expansion, playthrough, and then a lot of people take breaks and come back for the next expansion, like they're knocking it out of the park. He's like, yeah, we've got this system. It's not overtly risky. We have the ability to be sustainable, to continue to deliver content on time, which when you start to look at it, I think when we look at Guild Wars, when we look at some of the MMOs that have really struggled, WoW within Shadowlands, delivering content on time, like that's a real key difference maker. Why play Final Fantasy XIV? Because they deliver content on time. And that ends up being a way you kind of beat out a lot of the frustration that you end up seeing in other gaming communities.
Especially in a live service model, right? Like if the next Cyberpunk game is delayed by 2 years, then we just don't pay them. Right. And then you just wait. And then when the content comes out, you pay them. And then it's in theory a full featured game on launch. And if it is, then transaction's complete. But in a live service game where these companies are hoping that you're going to drop at least a little money on their store or something like that, or they're asking for a literal subscription every month. Something like Ashes of Creation has a big thing to take on. The existing subscription MMOs have the advantage of they grew up in an era with the subscription being the standard.
Yeah.
We were used to that. We were used to, I mean, back then you could still get like internet hours or browser hours on like a disc in the mail.
Yeah.
So like, the world just worked differently.
Hours.
Yeah, the world just worked differently. And so, like, when you look at what kind of bringing on a subscription MMO today, what that struggles with is, I think the core of this topic, the core of this opinion is don't change that much, because the strength of an MMO is that it ages. The strength of an MMO is that you're investing in a world. And while iterative change feels good in the short term, big change long-term devalues your old content because it breaks it. And while you do run the risk of the game becoming stale, if people choose to eat at the same burger joint every single day in and day out, and they simply say, I want another burger, then as a burger joint, your job is to say, then go eat other places. I'm not telling you to only eat burgers. What I am telling you is we're going to make the best burgers. And next year, we're going to learn to make even better burgers. And so the next time you want to make a burger, I want you to think of us. But that doesn't have to be tomorrow. That doesn't have to be the day after that. We're going to be here. And we're going to keep serving burgers day in and day out. That's what we do. And so like, that's the strength of Final Fantasy, is that if you ever, like, if I wanted to play a different kind of game, I just go play a different game. And then I ultimately, because MMORPGs are like my favorite game type, I always want to go back to having a burger. I don't always want a burger today. I'm really enjoying Call of Duty's DMZ mode. That really surprises me. The Division was fun, but it didn't like hook me. Apex was fun, but it didn't hook me. And like DMZ has hooked me. I'm loving it. But as soon as I hop off DMZ for the night, because I don't want to play it alone. I want to keep playing games. Maybe I should just go hop on 14. And so like 14 always being there, always having something to work on is like a huge strength. And World of Warcraft has not always had that. Guild Wars has not always had enough new content for people. They've had gaps in the past. They've gotten a lot better in recent history. But I think that's the core answer is when you're an MMO, don't make massive changes. You can make isolated, expansion-related, siloed iterations that can be standalone experiments, and the good ones, people have been interested in Eureka a lot longer than I could have predicted. There are still tons of people running Eureka. I thought that was going to just fall flat on its face after it was over. And it's gone through some downturns, but it just keeps coming back. So the true silos can stand for themselves. And if something really isn't used that much, like when Mogtalk organized all that Moogle, the Chocobo racing, there were content creators in there who were like, I've never done this. Because that, things like Lords of Verminion, they don't have the Lords of Verminion minion for clearing the 24th challenge is not hard to get. I got it with red pandas, just red pandas. I just slammed red pandas at everything for all 24 levels and cleared everything. And yet that minion on Lala achievements is one of the rarest minions in the game because people don't play it. And like, yes, there's that one or two people that are going to leave in the comments like, I play it every day. But compared to the total player base of nearly 30 million now, it just hasn't been cleared by that many people. And those silos can afford to exist as experiments. So I think that's where it is I think the answer to MMOs is like, stop trying to break your mold. Your goal is to release one ice mold and keep making ice in that mold continuously. And if you ever want to make a new ice mold, that's the beauty of something like WoW Classic, where it functions as a different game than vanilla did. It functions as a different game. And they did it under the same sub. So something like Final Fantasy 11 versus Final Fantasy 14, very different games. If they go under the same sub, that's a huge value.
Final Fantasy 11
works on another game.
If they added that as the thing, like, and they've talked about that. So like, this isn't us just making stuff up. Like the developers and director, especially Final Fantasy 11, says that's on the table. But when it comes down to then the back end stuff, like this is where it's like when we start talking about technical debt as a whole, like we know that there's a lot of work that has to go into play to do something like that. And I would love to see that because I know some people have asked for Final Fantasy 14 1.0, and it's unfortunate how that isn't going to happen. Like maybe we'll get to see a private server kind of spun up so people can kind of experience what 1.0 was like for just the fact is people coming into Stormblood or, Shadowbringers or Endwalker, and they're like, the game does homage to 1.0, especially in the trailers, so there is something like, man, I guess you can only experience that through like YouTube, but 11 really is that. Like 14 didn't even deliver on kind of how 11 was even at that state. So when people talk about classic servers, Final Fantasy 11 would be the key, classic version of it. And I know a lot of players, 11 players, like even if you guys haven't been following Hunting for Games, he just recently came back into content creation. He's taking a little break. But he was covering Horizon 11, which is another private server. Like all this is being done by passionate Final Fantasy 11 players who have felt abandoned by Final Fantasy 14. And that's a big part of the narrative. That's a lot of where I bring in my critique as a Final Fantasy 11 player in 14. 1.0 tried to be that, but it didn't. It didn't succeed because it didn't even deliver on what Final Fantasy 11 already offered, right? So when we're talking about how games age, talking like Yoshi P even commented like when somebody was asking him about a new MMO, and he was like, the nightmare of trying to move people off of 14 into this new MMO. We tried that in the past and we still have 11 up and running. Like it's not like it's just everybody's just going to move to the newest MMO. There's going to be people who really crave that experience or that community or that gameplay style, right? So just them putting it under one like subscription, I think would be so cool because a lot of people, like I see Jay kind of trying to critique me in chat and he's misquoting me throughout. And that's just the aspect of the internet, right? But when I advocate for like Final Fantasy 11 and that kind of content, it would be really cool if you, in this case, who've never played 11, got to go experience that, right?
It's the KFC Taco Bell method. You're starting to say, we're not a chicken company learning to make tacos.
Yeah.
also own a taco company, and now we're going to begin serving those at the same place. And the nice thing about that is sometimes you don't want what the first place has. And so it's really nice to have both restaurants under one name. That's what Final Fantasy 11, that's the advantage. Is instead of changing your formula, have another game. ArenaNet is working on another MMO in Unreal Engine 5. There are people that speculate that is Guild Wars 3. There is no evidence that it's Guild Wars 3. It could be. There's no evidence it's not. It says for an existing IP, but I think people assume that means like their existing IPs. So they're like, well, that's their big existing MMO. But like, A, that's not their only IP that they own. B, it's not the only IP out there that would need to license to a publisher. There's a lot of IP. There's a lot of IP out there in creative space that isn't owned or currently in a license with a gaming company, much less an exclusive one.
Yeah.
And so if, you know, like as we see things like Star Wars and stuff be something that's changed a lot over the years with who has the rights to build for it,
Yeah,
you know, it could be anything. But ultimately, if that was a subscription-based game or if they had a big combined launcher, ideally that's something where they're saying, hey, if you want to take a break, here are other great games by us. That way, if you're like, I don't want to play this game, but I like you guys. And that way you get the strength of something like Paradox games, where you have these really unique flavors, and each flavor is truly standalone, and they're not trying to be anything they're not. They really are. Paradox games are just creatively, you would think those ideas, you're like, nobody could actually make a game that's successful like that, but they do. Paradox Games makes crazy games. And yet, if you like one of their games, maybe you'd like to try one of their other crazy unique flavors. And so like, I think instead of continuing to try to reinvent a game, I think you stick to your core values and keep doing takes on it. And then add these siloed experiences. I think that was the beauty of Final Fantasy XIV's exploratory zones. I think that's the beauty of like relic systems, these things that are just inherently siloed to one expansion, and after that become very optional. So building those opportunities in for yourself, kind of like a menu that always has like 2 spots at the top for like, ask your waiter for our seasonal flavor. It's like, here's our 10 items. These are the 3 crowd favorites. We always have a seasonal menu. Be sure to ask your waiter for the seasonal menu. And so, you know, Final Fantasy does that. Guild Wars does that. Not as much, but, and like World of Warcraft does that, where like each expansion, you can have some expansion related features, but the core menu of your game needs to be something you never drift from. Because what I'm telling you about my initial impressions of Dragonflight is that I'm loving that. And as I see New World already iterating, it's something I hope they don't lose. I know there's a lot of people that are like, I didn't like New World. That's fine. But there are a lot of people who did, and they're going to come and go as it gets various updates. And when they have updates, it's going to spike back up to 50, 60,000 concurrent or whatever that number was. And when it's been a while since the update, those numbers are going to fall away, right? We're not going to sit here. I'm not obligated. If I like Brimstone Sands, I'm not obligated to play it every day for the rest of my life. Play it till it's not fun. It's a huge zone. Take a break. So, and then when 1.8 comes out, come on back. It's not a subscription game. Just re-download it if you need to.
Well, and what we're seeing in the terms of subscription-based games, like we haven't seen, like we know Blue Protocol is launching as a free-to-play. Like you said, New World doesn't have a subscription buy-to-play kind of MMO. Embers Adrift is something that I've been kind of toying around with a little bit. That is a buy-to-play and subscription-based game, really set in a hardcore old school MMO. That's what that's what I was born into with the games themselves, like the really hard grind, the grinds that would make anybody who looks at Final Fantasy 14 and go, "Ooh, I don't want to do that." Brian, you're ridiculous for wanting to do some kind of grind like that, because it took me, I think, hours just to hit level 2. You know, it's just like, all right, here we go. We're just going to be grinding on these mobs. We're going to be doing this. No quest markers and things like that. It's truly a weird experience, because it's going to be something where I see a lot of people like advocate that that's what they want, but then they don't show up and put their money into it. And then it's like, will this game succeed or not? I don't know. They're not doing any marketing.
No, I want to watch a 50-minute compilation of some guy's 100 hours of pain.
Yeah, I know.
That's how I want to consume that. I don't actually want.
I don't want to consume. Like, yeah, a lot of people are just like, I'd rather just kind of watch somebody suffer. And so
that's how I watch it. That's how I watch Rust. I don't play Rust.
Right.
I've watched a lot of hours of Rust on YouTube where somebody's cut together these amazing narratives that game can spin up.
And so, like on that note, is that what I could see if they do combine Final Fantasy 14 and 11's like subscription model, then if they do decide to open up another MMO at some point, like well, let's say they want to go with an action MMO or something where they're like, what would be different enough that it wouldn't, you couldn't put it into 14 because it would literally shake the foundation, like shake the foundation of the game so hard that it would just, at that point, you're like, we're just going to build a new game, you know, but then all of a sudden, if they have that one sub model, it doesn't matter. They don't have to worry about shifting people from 14 into the new game because it's not going to necessarily appeal to people who want that. But then they could sit back and say, hey, this is the cost. This is, you know, like Apple has their Apple One. Like when it comes to the subscription-based model, one of the things that has been fatiguing is there's just so many things that want you to subscribe to them, right? And we've seen less and less people do that. But the subscription-based model, I think, is the most fair in terms of the players who are actively playing. But we're also looking at and talking about a generational problem because look at the gamers that are coming up that are in middle school and high school. Like they've all been trained on free-to-play cosmetic shop, right? Free-to-play cosmetic. And so when it comes down to it, it becomes a harder sell for us to kind of say, hey, why don't you spend a little money and then keep spending money or check out the free trial, which, you know, you should absolutely check out the free trial because it is that good. It all the way through 60, Heaven's Word expansion, doesn't cost you a dime. And it's weird because the next thing I have to say whenever I'm talking to somebody new and I go, and don't spend any money until you hit 60 because then the game's going to ask for you for money each and every month for you to continue to play. And having a one subscription ends up being where, yeah, I think you get more bang for the buck. But Square Enix's CFO or CEO, no, he was the CFO, the CEO has stated that they're not really actually looking to do that in terms of that. And that was a couple years ago. So I don't know if there's any changes on their business front, but I could see them partnering with PlayStation Now. I could see them partnering with, you know, some kind of subscription, you know, bundle, you know, hey, we're going to, like, you see Disney Plus do this with Hulu. You know, like all of a sudden it's like, hey, we're going to start bundling in these subs and to try and bring in more people to the core game.
Well, I mean, Paul's really summed up the entire topic. Like, double down on your original game. Double down on your original idea. Add the new thing. Double down on the original. Expand the original thing. And so I think that's what each individual game needs to do. And what publishers need to do if they want to be in more than one vertical is open up that one subscription, open up that idea, even if it's Guild Wars, which doesn't have a subscription. Say, okay, I have my burger joint. I'm not going to turn it into somewhere that tries to be good at everything. Those restaurants are very rarely wildly good at anything. I'm going to offer a different restaurant entirely. And I'm going to spend that money up. And that's how big publishers function. It's not just Final Fantasy 14 making up all of their money. Ideally, Octopath Traveler did make money. And my understanding is that it did. Ideally, Project Triangle Strategy is making money. Like ideally, these other titles that come out do make money. And watching the Preach interview with the classic stuff, it seems like they weren't sure that there would really be the backing that there is. But now that there is, they're like, this is great. Like, this is awesome. We love that people are loving this. And it's kind of taken them aback. And so I think they just keep doubling down. I don't know what happens with Classic. I don't know. I think you just make a loop. I think you just start, we're going to start mixing them up and pick a different season and go back. You could start to kind of PoE Diablo this, where you kind of like add a modifier for a season. So, you know, start to go and mess with class balance a little bit. And if you do that, in my opinion, then you kind of have ladder and non-ladder. So like the base game has none of those modifiers on or whatever, and everything kind of just washes down into it. But if you play during, then you have an option during character creation. Like, do I want to go on one of these ladder servers that has been messed with? So there can be that kind of place that's more ongoing if you want to keep doubling down on the original game. But there is this kind of seasonal reset that ties it to something weird. Goes and puts a modifier on the whole game. So I don't know. I think